Jake sat in the darkened interior of his cabin, the flickering glow of a small wood stove casting elongated shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the dense pines that encircled the clearing where his remote cabin stood, far from civilization. The isolation wasn't a choice he had actively made. It had been thrust upon him like a cruel sentence, one that he bore with an aching kind of resignation. The fire had claimed more than just a house. It had consumed his life, his family, and his ability to believe in the inherent kindness of the world. His brother, Mark, and Mark's son, Toby, had been in the house when it happened. Jake could still hear their voices sometimes, echoing faintly in the recesses of his mind, as though they were just beyond a wall he couldn't breach. The sound of Toby's laughter, the uninhibited, joyous giggle of a 6-year-old, had haunted him most of all. The cabin was modest, barely more than a shell. A single room housed a bed pushed against the far wall, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with canned food and whatever non-perishables he could carry in from town. His only luxury, if it could be called that, was a second-hand armchair by the fire, its fabric worn thin. It faced a window that overlooked the forest, but Jake rarely looked outside. The world beyond the glass seemed like a taunt, alive and thriving while he was withering away inside. Every morning, Jake woke before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because his mind would not let him sleep. The nightmares were vivid, flames licking at the edges of his vision, the smell of smoke clinging to his skin, and the helpless sensation of knowing he couldn't save them. He would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor until the cold seeped through his bare feet and forced him to move. The first task of the day was always the same: chopping wood. The physical exertion was one of the few things that could quiet his thoughts, even if only for a short time. He would swing the axe with a ferocity that surprised him, as though he could split the fire itself with each strike. The rhythm of it, the dull thud of the axe meeting the log, the crack as it split, was almost hypnotic. But even this routine was tinged with guilt. Mark had taught him how to chop wood when they were kids, their father standing by with an approving nod. Jake hadn't thought about those lessons until now, when every split log felt like another piece of his past breaking away. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no phone. Jake had cut himself off completely, a self-imposed exile that he justified as necessary for his survival. What was the point of being connected to a world that had already taken everything from him? His trips into the nearest town, a 2-hour drive down winding, unpaved roads, were rare and utilitarian. He would stock up on essentials, food, fuel for the generator he rarely used, and leave before anyone could strike up a conversation. The townsfolk had learned not to ask too many questions. They saw the shadows under his eyes, the hollowness in his expression, and they knew better than to pry. The few people who had tried to reach out, neighbors from his old life, distant relatives, even the fire department's grief counselor, had been met with polite but firm refusals. Jake didn't want their pity, and he certainly didn't want their help. He carried his grief like a second skin, and the thought of shedding it, of letting someone else share the weight, felt like a betrayal to Mark and Toby. They were gone, and he was here. That was the natural order of things now. Some days, Jake would find himself staring at the lone photograph he had managed to save from the fire. It had been on the mantelpiece, its frame blackened, but the image miraculously intact. It showed Mark and Toby sitting on the porch of their old house, Toby grinning with a gap-toothed smile as Mark ruffled his hair. Jake had taken the picture, and he could remember the exact moment it was captured. The golden light of late afternoon, the smell of Mark's homemade barbecue wafting through the air, the sound of crickets beginning their evening song. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered happiness, and now it was nothing more than a memory trapped behind glass. He couldn't bring himself to hang the photo anywhere. It stayed in a drawer, buried beneath spare batteries and old receipts, as though keeping it hidden would dull the ache of loss. But it didn't. Nothing did. The pain was a constant, a dull throb that occasionally flared into something sharper, more unbearable. On those days, Jake would sit by the fire with a bottle of whiskey, drinking until the edges of his grief blurred, and he could almost pretend it wasn't there. The forest around the cabin was both a refuge and a prison. Jake had always loved the woods, their quiet stillness, the way the light filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns. But now, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The isolation that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating, as though the trees themselves were closing in on him. At night, the cabin was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the creak of the wooden floorboards as Jake paced back and forth, unable to sleep. He had taken to writing in a journal, not because he thought it would help, but because it gave him something to do. The entries were disjointed, a stream of consciousness that veered between anger, guilt, and despair. "I should have been there," he wrote one night, the words scrawled so forcefully that the pen tore through the paper. "I should have saved them." The fire had been ruled an accident, a faulty electrical wire, the investigators said. But Jake couldn't accept that. He replayed the night over and over in his mind, searching for something he could have done differently, some way he could have changed the outcome. The what-ifs consumed him, a constant refrain that echoed in the stillness of the cabin. The days bled into each other, one indistinguishable from the next. Jake lived in a state of suspended animation, caught between the past and a future he couldn't imagine. He didn't know if he wanted to heal, if he wanted to find a way back to the world. The pain was all he had left of Mark and Toby, and letting it go felt like losing them all over again. And so, Jake remained in the cabin, a solitary figure in the wilderness, carrying the weight of his grief like a heavy cloak. The fire inside the wood stove burned low, its embers glowing faintly, as though mirroring the last flickers of hope within him. The snowstorm raged outside, fierce and unrelenting. Wind howled through the forest like the anguished cries of ghosts, shaking the cabin's walls and forcing Jake to shove a blanket under the door to keep the cold from seeping in. He sat hunched in his armchair, staring into the flickering flames of the wood stove, the silence of his solitary life broken only by the occasional hiss of melting snow on the roof. He had grown used to the storms, to the long winters where nature seemed to mock his efforts to survive. This one was no different, except for the gnawing feeling of restlessness in his gut. Something about this night unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he heard it, a sound barely audible above the wind, but distinct enough to send a chill down his spine. A sharp, plaintive cry, raw with pain and desperation. At first, Jake thought he'd imagined it. Another cruel trick of his mind, like the echoes of laughter he sometimes thought he heard in the stillness. But then it came again, louder this time, and unmistakably real. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The sound was coming from outside, near the door. It didn't sound human, but neither did it belong to any animal he could readily identify. For a long moment, he sat rooted to the chair, heart pounding as he debated whether to investigate or ignore it. The cry came again, a strangled whimper that tugged at something deep inside him. Against his better judgment, Jake grabbed the heavy flashlight from the shelf by the door and cautiously opened it. The wind slapped him in the face, blinding him with a spray of snow. He shielded his eyes and scanned the porch. At first he saw nothing, just the swirling white of the storm and the black shadows of the forest beyond. But then the beam of his flashlight landed on a figure lying motionless at the edge of the porch, half buried in the snow. Jake squinted, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. It was a wolf, a she-wolf, to be exact. Her silver-gray fur was matted with blood, and one of her legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. She lifted her head weakly at the light, her golden eyes locking onto his. Jake had seen wild animals before, bears, deer, even wolves from a distance, but there was something about her gaze that rooted him to the spot. It wasn't just fear or pain. It was a raw, primal plea for help. His first instinct was to back away and shut the door. Wolves were dangerous, even injured ones. There was no telling what she might do if he approached her. But then she let out another whimper, softer this time, almost pitiful. The sound was so full of anguish that it cut through his fear like a knife. "Damn it," Jake muttered under his breath. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting through his flannel shirt like needles. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the wolf, keeping the flashlight trained on her. She didn't move, just lay there trembling, her breath shallow and labored. Up close, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Her paw was caught in what looked like the remnants of a rusted trap, the sharp metal teeth biting cruelly into her flesh. Her coat was streaked with mud and blood, and her sides heaved with exertion. Jake hesitated, the rational part of his brain screaming at him to leave her there. This was nature's way, wasn't it? Survival of the fittest. But another part of him, the part that still remembered what it felt like to lose everything, couldn't bring himself to turn away. "All right," he said, his voice trembling as much from fear as from the cold. "I'll help you. But if you bite me, we're both dead." The wolf didn't respond, of course, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Trust, maybe, or desperation. Jake crouched down and carefully slid his hands on her body. She flinched, letting out a low growl that sent a jolt of panic through him, but she didn't snap. Her body was alarmingly light, her ribs sharp against his hands as he lifted her. The trek back into the cabin felt like an eternity. The wolf's hot breath steamed against his neck, her blood dripping onto his boots as he carried her over the threshold and set her down on the floor by the fire. For a moment, they just stared at each other, man and beast, both unsure of what would happen next. Jake grabbed an old blanket and draped it over her shivering form. Then he turned his attention to her leg. The trap was rusted and jagged, and it had done significant damage. Jake swallowed hard, the sight of the torn flesh turning his stomach, but he forced himself to focus. He fetched his toolbox and a pair of heavy gloves, his hands shaking as he worked to pry the trap open. The wolf whimpered and thrashed weakly, but she was too weak to fight him off. When the trap finally came loose, Jake tossed it aside with a shudder of disgust. Blood welled from the wound, and he pressed a clean rag against it, murmuring soothing nonsense to the wolf as she let out a series of soft, heart-wrenching whines. It took him nearly an hour to clean and bandage the injury, his makeshift efforts clumsy but effective enough to stop the bleeding. By the time he was done, Jake was exhausted. He sank back into the armchair, his muscles aching and his nerves frayed. The wolf lay still by the fire, her eyes half closed as she panted softly. He wasn't sure if she would survive the night, but at least she wasn't out in the storm anymore. Jake watched her in silence, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't remember the last time he had cared about something, or someone, other than himself. The act of helping her, as small and insignificant as it might have seemed, had stirred something in him. A faint glimmer of purpose, buried beneath the layers of grief and isolation. As the storm raged on outside, Jake found himself talking to the wolf, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her about Mark and Toby, about the fire, about the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness. The wolf didn't respond, of course, but her steady gaze seemed to hold an understanding that no human had ever offered him. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow over the forest. The wolf was still alive, her breathing steadier than it had been the night before. Jake knelt beside her, a strange sense of relief washing over him. "You're a fighter," he said, his voice hoarse. "Guess we both are, huh?" For the first time in what felt like years, Jake allowed himself a small, tentative smile. The morning after the storm, Jake sat by the fire, sipping bitter coffee from a tin mug. The she-wolf lay on a blanket a few feet away, her body rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths. The bandages on her leg were already stained with blood, but she seemed more at ease, her golden eyes flicking to Jake every now and then with a strange, wary trust. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just the fact that she'd survived the storm, but the way she'd looked at him when he carried her inside. It was as if she'd been asking for more than just help. There was something unfinished, something unresolved, and the thought gnawed at him. Wolves didn't travel alone, not like this. If she was out there, injured and desperate, there had to be a reason. And then it hit him. Her pups. Jake froze, the realization making his stomach drop. If she was a mother, and if she had pups somewhere in the storm, they wouldn't have survived the night on their own. The image of tiny, helpless creatures shivering in the snow flashed through his mind, and he felt a pang of guilt sharper than he expected. He had brought the mother inside, but what if he doomed her young to die alone out there? He set the mug down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied the wolf. "Did you leave them behind?" he asked softly, his voice cracking in the silence. She didn't respond, of course, but her eyes met his, and he swore he saw something there, an urgency, a plea. "Damn it," Jake muttered under his breath, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat and boots. The thought of going back out into the snow, of trudging through the freezing forest, made him hesitate. But the alternative, leaving her pups to die, was worse. He couldn't live with that. Before he left, he crouched down next to the wolf. Her ears twitched, and she let out a faint, strained whimper. "I'll find them," he said, more to himself than to her. "If they're still out there, I'll bring them back." Jake stepped out into the cold, pulling his coat tight against the biting wind. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was brutal. Snow blanketed the forest in knee-deep drifts, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. He scanned the ground for tracks, though the snowstorm had erased most signs of movement. Still, he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. The forest was eerily silent, the muffled stillness of the snow broken only by the crunch of his boots. As he moved deeper into the trees, he thought about Mark and Toby, about how helpless he'd felt the night of the fire. The same helplessness clawed at him now, but this time he had a chance to do something. He could save these pups, even if he couldn't save his family. After what felt like hours of trudging through the snow, Jake stumbled across faint tracks leading away from the clearing where he'd found the wolf. They were barely visible, half filled with fresh snow, but they were there. He crouched down to examine them, his breath fogging the air. The tracks were small, too small to belong to an adult wolf. His heart quickened. "Please still be alive," he murmured, following the trail. The tracks led him to a shallow, snow-covered slope, where a cluster of rocks jutted out like jagged teeth. At the base of the slope, partially hidden by the drifts, was a small den. Jake's pulse raced as he approached, his boots slipping on the icy ground. He crouched down by the entrance, peering into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, just the black void of the den and the faint scent of earth and decay. But then a tiny movement caught his eye, a shiver, a tremble, and then he heard it, a faint, pitiful whimper that made his chest tighten. "Hey," Jake said softly, reaching into the den with a gloved hand. "It's okay. I'm here to help." Two small shapes huddled together at the back of the den, their fur matted and their eyes squeezed shut against the cold. Wolf pups, barely old enough to fend for themselves. They were trembling violently, their breath shallow and ragged. Jake's throat tightened at the sight of them. "It's all right," he said, his voice shaking. "I've got you." Carefully, he reached in and scooped up the pups, cradling them against his chest. They were alarmingly light, their ribs sharp under his fingers. One of them let out a weak yelp, struggling feebly against his grip, but they were too weak to fight him off. Jake wrapped his coat around them, shielding them from the wind as he turned and began the long trek back to the cabin. The journey back was brutal. The added weight of the pups made every step feel like a battle, and the cold seemed to seep into his bones, sapping his strength. He stumbled more than once, his legs threatening to give out, but he forced himself to keep going. The image of the she-wolf's pleading eyes was burned into his mind, urging him forward. By the time he reached the cabin, Jake was on the verge of collapse. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the warmth of the fire hitting him like a physical force. The she-wolf lifted her head weakly, her ears perking up at the sight of him. Jake knelt by her side, unwrapping the pups and placing them gently on the blanket beside her. The wolf let out a low, trembling whine, nosing the pups with a mixture of urgency and relief. They responded with faint cries, their tiny bodies pressing against hers for warmth. Jake sat back on his heels, watching the reunion with a lump in his throat. He had done it. He had saved them. For the first time in what felt like years, Jake felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. Connection. The knowledge that even in his broken state he could still make a difference. As he leaned against the wall, catching his breath, the she-wolf looked at him, her golden eyes filled with something he could only describe as gratitude. It was a look that pierced through his isolation, his guilt, his self-loathing. It was a reminder that even in the depths of winter, even in the face of loss, life could still find a way to endure. And so could he. The morning light seeped through the frost-covered window of Jake's cabin, bathing the room in a muted glow. The warmth from the wood stove filled the space, but Jake could still feel the icy grip of winter beyond the walls. It had been 2 days since he brought the wolf pups back, and the cabin felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The mother wolf lay curled on the blanket near the fire, her injured legs stretched out awkwardly. The 2 pups snuggled against her side, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each shallow breath. Jake stood by the stove, stirring a pot of water and canned meat, his stomach grumbling. He had intended it as his breakfast, but as he glanced over at the she-wolf, her eyes half-lidded but watchful, guilt gnawed at him. She needed it more than he did. "All yours," he muttered, pouring the warm broth into a shallow pan and sliding it toward her. She sniffed at it cautiously before lapping it up with quick, desperate strokes of her tongue. The pups stirred at the sound, their noses twitching. Jake bent down and tore off small chunks of meat, carefully feeding each pup. Their sharp teeth grazed his fingers as they chewed hungrily, and he winced but didn't pull away. It wasn't just the physical care that weighed on him. It was the silence between each task, the moments when he found himself staring at the wolves and realizing how deeply their survival now depended on him. For years, he had convinced himself that he had nothing left to give. Yet here he was scraping together food, cleaning wounds, and ensuring they stayed warm. It felt like a strange kind of penance. The she-wolf watched him closely whenever he approached her pups, her golden eyes narrowing. She hadn't growled or shown aggression since that first night, but the tension was palpable. Jake didn't blame her. She didn't trust him, not fully, and he wasn't sure he deserved her trust. "I'm not going to hurt them," he murmured one evening as he knelt by the fire, inspecting her leg. The wound was healing, though slowly, and the makeshift splint he'd applied seemed to be holding. I'm trying to help." Her gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of understanding. Or maybe he was just imagining it. Days turned into weeks, and Jake settled into a routine. He would wake early to chop wood and fetch water from the nearby stream, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The wolves would stir when he returned, the pups yipping softly as they wrestled with each other on the floor. Jake couldn't help but smile at their antics, though he quickly suppressed it. Smiling felt foreign, almost like a betrayal of the grief he carried. He spent hours tending to the she-wolf, cleaning her wound and ensuring she ate enough to produce milk for her pups. The process was messy and exhausting, but Jake didn't mind. The pups were growing stronger each day, their once bony frames filling out with fur-covered muscle. They were curious, too, always sniffing at his boots or tugging at the hem of his coat with their tiny teeth. At first, Jake found it annoying, but over time, their playful persistence wore him down. He began to look forward to their clumsy attempts to pounce on his feet, their yips of excitement when he walked through the door. The she-wolf, however, remained cautious. She would let Jake near her pups, but she kept a watchful eye on him, her body tense with readiness to protect them. Jake respected her boundaries, moving slowly and speaking softly whenever he approached. He wasn't sure when it happened, but one day, as he sat by the fire, feeding the pups scraps of meat, the she-wolf shifted closer to him. Her nose brushed against his hand briefly before she pulled back, her eyes meeting his with something that felt like cautious approval. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. It was the first time in years that someone or something had willingly reached out to him. He didn't deserve it, he thought. Not after what had happened to Mark and Toby. But he couldn't deny the strange warmth that bloomed in his chest at the gesture. As the wolves grew stronger, so did Jake's sense of purpose. The days no longer blurred together in a haze of grief and isolation. Each morning, he woke with a list of tasks to complete. Gathering food, reinforcing the cabin against the cold, ensuring the wolves stayed healthy. The once agonizing silence of the cabin was now filled with the sounds of life. The crackle of the fire, the soft whines of the pups, the rhythmic thud of Jake's boots as he moved about. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. The nights were the worst. As the wolves slept by the fire, Jake would sit in his armchair, staring at the photograph of Mark and Toby he'd pulled from the drawer. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering in his ear that he didn't deserve to feel this sense of purpose, that he had failed the people who mattered most. "You think this makes up for it?" he whispered to the photo one night, his voice thick with bitterness. "Taking care of a damn wolf and her pups? You think this fixes anything?" The photo, of course, didn't answer. But the she-wolf stirred, lifting her head to look at him. Her gaze was steady, almost piercing, and Jake felt a strange sense of shame under her scrutiny. She didn't know his past, didn't know the weight he carried. All she knew was that he had saved her and her pups. And maybe Jake realized that was enough. As winter dragged on, Jake began to notice changes in himself. He was eating more regularly, his appetite no longer dulled by the fog of depression. His hands, once trembling and clumsy, had grown steadier from the daily tasks of survival. And the nightmares, while not gone, had lessened, replaced by dreams of the forest, of running through the snow with the wolves by his side. One afternoon, as the pups tumbled around his feet, Jake found himself laughing, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that startled even him. The sound felt alien, almost like it belonged to someone else. But as he looked at the wolves, their heads tilted in curiosity, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, like a flame flickering in the wind, but it was there. For the first time since the fire, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely broken. The wolves had given him something to fight for, something to care about, and in caring for them, he had started to find a way back to himself. As the sun set that evening, casting the cabin in a warm, golden light, Jake sat by the fire with the she-wolf at his feet and the pups curled up beside him. For the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't feel so overwhelming. The snow had begun to melt. Thin streams of water ran down the edges of the forest, trickling under the blanket of pines and carrying with them the unmistakable promise of spring. Jake stood at the edge of the clearing near his cabin, his breath clouding in the cool morning air. The sun was brighter, the days were longer, and the forest that had once been locked in silence now stirred with the faint hum of life returning. Inside the cabin, the she-wolf was stretched out by the fire, her leg now healed, though the faint scars remained. Her pups were no longer tiny, helpless creatures. Their legs were sturdy, their fur thicker and glossier. They had grown confident, bounding through the cabin with wild energy, knocking over whatever stood in their way. Jake had taken to leaving the door slightly ajar to let them practice venturing outside, though they always came scrambling back in, eager for his attention or the comfort of their mother. As much as he loved having them there, Jake knew the time was coming. The she-wolf's gaze had grown distant in recent days, her ears twitching at the sounds beyond the cabin walls. Her instincts were pulling her back to the wild, and Jake could feel the growing tension in her. She had started pacing near the door, her movements restless, her nose lifting to the air as though she could smell the life awakening in the forest. Jake told himself he was ready for this. He had always known the wolves couldn't stay. The cabin was a sanctuary, a place to heal, but it wasn't a home for creatures like them. They belonged out there, in the wilderness, free and unbound. But even as he repeated this truth to himself, a knot of dread twisted in his chest. He had grown attached to them in ways he hadn't thought possible. They weren't just animals anymore. They were family. Letting them go felt like tearing himself apart. That evening, as the fire crackled low in the stove, Jake sat in his armchair, watching the wolves. The pups were sprawled out on the floor, exhausted from a day of play. The she-wolf lay nearby, her golden eyes fixed on Jake. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the unspoken understanding that passed between them. "You're ready to leave, aren't you?" he said softly, breaking the silence. His voice was thick, and he hated the way it wavered. The wolf tilted her head slightly, as though she understood. "It's okay," Jake continued, forcing the words out. "I knew this would happen. You gotta go back. That's where you belong." The wolf didn't move, but her eyes never left his. Jake felt exposed under that gaze, as though she could see the cracks in him, the parts of himself he tried so hard to keep hidden. It wasn't fair. He had already lost so much. Why did he have to lose them, too? But he knew the answer. He had always known. The next morning, Jake gathered what little food he could spare, strips of dried meat, scraps from his last meal, and bundled it into a cloth. It wasn't much, but it would give the wolves a head start while they adjusted to the wild again. He also found an old scarf in the drawer, one that had belonged to Mark. It smelled faintly of smoke and memories, and for a moment, Jake hesitated. But then he wrapped it around the bundle and placed it by the door. The pups were waiting for him outside, their eager yips breaking the morning stillness. The she-wolf stood a few feet away, her head held high, her posture alert. She looked stronger now, almost regal, her silver-gray coat catching the light as she watched him approach. Jake knelt by the pups, ruffling their fur one last time as they wriggled under his hands. They were no longer the frail, shivering creatures he had pulled from the snow. They were full of life, brimming with energy and curiosity. And yet, as much as it filled him with pride to see them so strong, it also broke something inside him. He had nursed them, protected them, loved them, and now he had to let them go. "I guess this is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stood slowly, his knees creaking, and looked at the she-wolf. "You take care of them, all right? They're good kids." The wolf stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate. For a moment, Jake thought she might growl or nudge her pups away from him. Instead, she pressed her nose against his hand, her breath warm against his skin. It wasn't a gesture of submission. It was something more. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe a farewell. Jake swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. He didn't want them to see him like this, but he couldn't help it. He felt like he was losing a piece of himself all over again. He watched as they disappeared into the forest, the pups darting ahead and tumbling over each other, the she-wolf leading them with quiet authority. They didn't look back. Jake stood there long after they were gone, the scarf still clutched in his hands, the ache in his chest spreading like fire. Back in the cabin, the silence was deafening. The walls seemed to press in on him, the emptiness sharper now than it had ever been. He sat by the fire, staring at the spot where the wolves had slept, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, so tightly his knuckles turned white. What now? He wondered. He had spent months caring for them, pouring himself into their survival. They had given him a purpose, a reason to get up every morning. Without them, he felt hollow, like a house stripped of its foundation. But as the days passed, something began to shift. Jake found himself venturing outside more often, walking through the forest, listening to the sounds of the world around him. The grief was still there, heavy and unrelenting, but it wasn't the only thing he felt anymore. There was something else, too, a quiet pride in what he had done. He had saved them. He had given them a chance to live, to thrive. And in doing so, he had found a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. One evening, weeks after the wolves had gone, Jake was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard a faint rustling in the underbrush. He froze, his axe poised mid-swing, his heart racing. For a moment, he thought it might be them, returning to him. But as he turned, he saw only the forest, silent and still, except for the wind moving through the trees. Jake exhaled slowly, lowering the axe. They weren't coming back, and that was okay. The forest was their home, just as the cabin was his. They didn't need him anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't need them the same way either. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clearing in a warm, golden light, Jake stood alone, his breath forming clouds in the cool air. The ache in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it was quieter now, less suffocating. He had let them go, and in doing so, he had taken a step forward, however small. For the first time in years, Jake felt something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. The snow had melted, giving way to patches of green that stretched across the forest floor, signaling the arrival of spring. The cabin, once buried in winter's silence, now echoed with the sounds of birdsong and the rustle of thawing trees swaying in the wind. Inside, Jake sat in his armchair, staring at the empty spot by the fire where the she-wolf and her pups used to rest. The blanket still lay there, faintly carrying their scent, but the warmth they brought was gone. The cabin, once alive with their presence, now felt hollow again. Jake told himself he had done the right thing by letting them go. They belonged to the wild, to the untamed freedom of the forest, not to the confines of his wooden walls. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. Every morning, he still reached for the tasks that had filled his days, feeding the pups, cleaning their messes, checking on the she-wolf's wound, only to stop, his hands hanging uselessly. The emptiness that greeted him now was sharp, almost unbearable, like a wound reopened. He tried to busy himself with small tasks, chopping wood or fixing the cabin's aging hinges, but even those felt purposeless. Every corner of the cabin reminded him of them. The pups tumbling over each other, their tiny teeth gnawing at his boots, the she-wolf's steady golden gaze that had anchored him in ways he didn't fully understand. Their absence was a constant ache, one that clung to him no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the frost-streaked windows, Jake's eyes fell on the shelf above the kitchen table. There, untouched for years, sat the camera Mark had given him. The leather strap was cracked, the lens smudged with dust, but it remained a piece of his brother, a relic of the life he had abandoned after the fire. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up, the weight of it both familiar and foreign. He remembered Mark's teasing grin the day he'd given it to him. "You got an eye for this stuff, Jake. You just need to use it." The memory was sharp, bittersweet, but instead of pulling away from it as he usually did, Jake held on to it. That afternoon, he stepped outside with the camera slung over his shoulder. The forest was alive with change. Streams, swollen from the melting snow, cut through the underbrush, and tiny buds peeked out from the ends of branches. Jake raised the camera to his eye and snapped his first photograph in years. Sunlight glinting off a patch of moss, vivid green against the gray bark of a tree. That small act of capturing life sparked something in Jake. He began taking the camera with him on walks through the woods, capturing the transformation of winter into spring. Each photograph pulled him deeper into the world he had distanced himself from, forcing him to notice the small, beautiful details. The shimmer of dew on a leaf, the curve of a bird's wing mid-flight, the ripple of water as it tumbled over smooth stones. The camera became his bridge to the present, grounding him in moments he had once let slip by. But the forest, as healing as it was, couldn't be his entire world. The wolves had reminded him of something he had buried along with Mark and Toby, his need for connection, for people. It had been years since he had set foot in town, and the thought of returning filled him with a quiet dread. He feared the looks, the questions, the well-meaning pity that would follow him. But as he stood by the cabin door one afternoon, staring at the forest stretching endlessly around him, Jake realized that he couldn't spend the rest of his life hiding. Driving into town felt surreal, the narrow roads winding through familiar yet forgotten scenery. When he parked on Main Street, he hesitated, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the diner across the street. The last time he'd been there was with Mark and Toby. The memory stung, but he forced himself to step out of the truck. The bell above the diner door jingled as Jake walked in, and Carla, the waitress who had worked there forever, looked up in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, setting down her coffee pot. "Jake Lawson. Thought you disappeared for good." Jake managed a small, hesitant smile. "Not quite." She led him to a booth without prying, pouring him a cup of coffee and chatting about the small, mundane changes in town. The simplicity of it eased Jake's tension. It felt good to listen, to sit among people again, even if he wasn't ready to share much of himself. Slowly, Jake began reconnecting with the world. He stopped by the hardware store for supplies, lingered in the square to watch kids playing, and even struck up brief conversations with familiar faces. Each interaction felt like a small step forward, a quiet defiance against the isolation he had wrapped himself in for so long. The wolves never left his thoughts. On his walks through the forest, he often searched for signs of them. Paw prints in the mud, tufts of fur caught on branches. One morning, as he knelt by a stream to photograph the glint of sunlight on the water, a sound behind him made him freeze. When he turned, there she was, the she-wolf. She stood at the edge of the clearing, thinner than when she had left but strong, her golden eyes locked on his. Behind her, the two pups, now lanky adolescents, peeked out from the underbrush. Jake didn't move, afraid the slightest motion might break the moment. The she-wolf held his gaze for a long, silent beat before dipping her head slightly, an acknowledgement, almost a thank you. Then, with a flick of her tail, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her pups trailing behind. Jake stood there long after they were gone, his chest tight and his hands trembling. He had let them go, and they had thrived. That knowledge filled him with a quiet pride, one that stayed with him as he returned to the cabin. That night, Jake sat by the fire, the camera resting in his lap. The ache of loss was still there, but it no longer consumed him. The wolves had given him something he hadn't thought possible, the courage to move forward. Their survival was proof that even in the harshest winters, life could endure. As spring unfolded around him, Jake began to rebuild, not by forgetting, but by carrying the memories of Mark, Toby, and the wolves with him. He wasn't whole, not yet, but for the first time in years, he believed that maybe one day he could be.